Good morning. Today we are going to learn about cross-sectional study design. Cross-sectional study is an observational study design. It can be either descriptive cross-sectional study or analytical cross-sectional study. As shown in this diagram, cross-sectional study collects data at one point in time on one sample. Okay. It can compare groups within this sample. There can be multiple subgroups in the population. So data from multiple subgroups can be compared in a cross-sectional study. These are the classic characteristics of a cross-sectional study. Data are collected only once from a cross-section of the population. That's why it is known as cross-sectional study. Data are collected from a cross-section of the population. Okay, data related to the disease or risk factors or both can be collected. Cross-sectional study is otherwise known as prevalence study. Why it is known as prevalence study? Prevalence of the disease condition or prevalence of risk factors are estimated in a cross-sectional study. So it is known as prevalence study. Cross-sectional study can be of two types, as told before. It can be descriptive cross-sectional study or analytical cross-sectional study. Descriptive cross-sectional study describes the disease condition in terms of time, place, person, and the risk factors. It describes time, place, person, and the risk factors. Risk factors are the determinants. Okay. Then it is known as descriptive cross-sectional study. Analytical cross-sectional study analyzes the difference in the occurrence of disease or occurrence of risk factors in different subgroups of the population. Analytical cross-sectional study can analyze the association between risk factor and outcome in different subgroups. Now we can go through the analysis of a cross-sectional study. Analysis of data can be done either by using descriptive statistics or by using inferential statistics. Descriptive statistics is done using mean, median, standard deviation, range or interquartile range for continuous variables. As all of us know, the variables can be either continuous variable or categorical variable. Continuous variables are described using mean, median, standard deviation, range or interquartile range. Continuous variable can be presented using diagrams such as histogram or box and whisker plot. Categorical variables are described using frequencies. So frequency distribution tables can be created for categorical variable. Categorical variables can be presented using diagrams such as bar diagram and pie diagram. Inferential statistics can be done using either odds ratio or chi-square test for categorical outcome. Sometimes outcome can be categorical, sometimes outcome of cross-sectional research can be continuous also. When outcome is categorical, we can use odds ratio or chi-square test. Chi-square test is applied when independent variable is also categorical and a dependent variable is also categorical. When outcome variable is continuous, we can use either parametric test or non-parametric test. As all of us know, parametric tests are applied when data is normally distributed. So what are the parametric tests? One sample t-test, independent sample t-test, and a paired t-test or one-way ANOVA test. One sample t-test is applied when continuous outcome, mean of the continuous outcome, is compared with a standard value. Independent sample t-test is applied when mean value of continuous variable in one group is compared with mean value of the same variable in another group. Paired sample t-test is applied when mean value of continuous variable before an intervention is compared with mean value of the same continuous variable after the intervention in the same group of people. One-way ANOVA test is applied when mean value of continuous variable in more than two groups are compared between each other. As already told, non-parametric tests are applied when data is not normally distributed. Right. Wilcoxon signed rank test for one sample can be applied as an alternative to one sample t-test. Wilcoxon signed rank test for paired sample can be applied as an alternative to paired sample t-test. Mann-Whitney U-test can be applied as an alternative to independent sample t-test. Kruskal-Wallis test can be applied as an alternative to one-way ANOVA test. These non-parametric tests like Wilcoxon signed rank test, Mann-Whitney U-test or Kruskal-Wallis test are applied when data is not normally distributed. Now we can go through the advantages of cross-sectional study. First advantage is the cost and time efficiency. Analytical cross-sectional research is typically quicker and more cost-effective compared to longitudinal studies. Longitudinal studies require data collection over an extended period of time, so it needs more time. Okay, analytical cross-sectional research is quicker and require less time only. Then, researchers can gather data from a diverse sample in a relatively short time frame. That is the advantage of cross-sectional study. Another advantage of cross-sectional study is that it collects data as a snapshot of the population. This research design provides a snapshot of a population's characteristics, attitudes, or behaviors at a specific moment in time. It allows researchers to assess the prevalence of certain traits or issues within the population. So, prevalence of certain characteristics, prevalence of certain traits, prevalence of issues such as knowledge level, attitude level, practice level, prevalence of conditions can be studied, prevalence of risk factors can be studied within the population, which can be valuable for making informed decision or policy recommendations. Another advantage of cross-sectional study design is that it can make comparisons and contrasts. Researchers can use cross-sectional data to make comparisons and contrasts between different subgroups or subpopulations. This quality helps identify patterns, trends, and differences in variables of interest. which can inform further research or interventions. Another advantage of cross-sectional study is that it is practical and feasible. Analytical cross-sectional research is practical for studying phenomena that are time sensitive or where conducting a long-term study is not feasible. Sometimes conducting a long-term research requires more time and more money and more resources that may not be feasible. In that case, we can do a cross-sectional research. Okay. Sometimes time-sensitive information. So sometimes some condition may be arising on a particular month or particular season. In that case, cross-sectional research will be more practical. For example, it can be used to quickly assess the impact of a new policy or program. One policy is implemented or a program is implemented to know the um, effect of that program. If researcher want to quickly assess the impact of the program, then he can use cross-sectional research. Another advantage of a cross-sectional study design is hypothesis generation. Cross-sectional data can be used to generate hypotheses for future research. By identifying association between variables in a single point in time, researchers can develop hypotheses, generate hypotheses that can be tested in more in-depth studies. What are the more in-depth studies? They are longitudinal or experimental research. Okay, so cross-sectional study can be used for hypothesis generation. Hypothesis testing can be done using longitudinal or experimental research. Now we can go through the disadvantages of cross-sectional study. Okay, one of the most important disadvantage of a cross-sectional research is that it lacks information about temporal association or causality. Temporal association means cause to effect relationship. We cannot come to a conclusion that there is a cause to effect relationship between independent variable and a dependent variable using a cross-sectional study. Cross-sectional studies provide data from a single point in time, which means that they cannot capture changes or developments over time. So, researchers cannot establish causality or cannot determine the sequence of events based solely on cross-sectional data. Okay, researcher cannot study the causality or cannot establish the causality or determine the sequence of events based on cross-sectional data. Why? Cross-sectional data collects data in a point in time. Okay, so longitudinal research may be needed to come to a causal relationship or temporal association or causality. Okay, another disadvantage of cross-sectional studies is that it gives limited insight into trends. Cross-sectional studies do not allow for the examination of trends or patterns that may emerge over time. Trends or patterns can be studied using longitudinal research or cohort study. Okay, this limitation can hinder the ability to identify long-term shifts or fluctuations in variables of interest. So that's a limitation of cross-sectional study. Okay, students, as told earlier, another disadvantage is that cross-sectional study cannot assess cause and effect relationship. Okay, earlier we discussed that a cross-sectional study cannot establish temporal relationships, right? Cross-sectional studies are primarily observational and descriptive in nature. They can identify associations between variables but cannot establish causal relationships. To establish causality, researchers need to employ experimental or longitudinal designs. Another disadvantage of a cross-sectional study is that there is a potential for selection bias. Cross-sectional studies may suffer from selection bias if the sample is not representative of the population of interest. So, bias can occur if certain groups are underrepresented or overrepresented. So, we have to choose a probability sampling method. Otherwise, some of the subgroups may be underrepresented, some of the subgroups may be overrepresented. What will happen? It can lead to results that do not accurately reflect the population. Okay, so potential for selection bias is a disadvantage of cross-sectional research. Another disadvantage of a cross-sectional study is that it is unable to study rare events. Cross-sectional studies are not well suited for studying rare events or infrequent events or phenomena, as they rely on data which are collected at a single point in time. Cross-sectional studies cannot study rare diseases. Which study design can be used for studying rare diseases? Case control studies may be more appropriate for rare event research. Another disadvantage of a cross-sectional study is that it is prone to recall bias. Okay, in cross-sectional studies that rely on self-reported data, participants may have difficulty in accurately recalling past events or experiences. So it can lead to recall bias. So that is one disadvantage of a cross-sectional study design. Now we can recap. A cross-sectional study is a research study that collects data at one specific point in time. It enables researchers to compare and study subgroups or subcohorts within the cohort of people studied. Within the group of people studied, we can compare between subgroups or subpopulations. What is an example of a cross-sectional research? Census is an example of a cross-sectional research. Census collects data from an entire population at a particular point in time. It aims to capture information about various variables such as socio-demographic variables, demographic variables such as age, gender, housing, all these things. Socio-economic factors such as education, occupation, income level. By analyzing this data, a census provides a comprehensive snapshot of the population's characteristics, allowing for cross-sectional analysis of variables across the entire population. We can do analytical cross-sectional research by analyzing the association between independent variables and dependent variables in various subgroups of population. What are the pros and cons of cross-sectional research? Pro or advantage is that cross-sectional research compares subgroups. cross-sectional studies are effective in describing and comparing subgroups of population in a particular point in time. What is a cone? Cannot measure change. A single cross-sectional study cannot measure change in population. For, for measuring change in the population, you would need to do a longitudinal study or cohort study. Okay, thank you.